Hello gold farmers, welcome to another Golden Farming video. In today's guide we'll be taking a look at 10 locations that we can farm linen cloth in Classic. 5 of these locations will take place on the Alliance side of things, and the other 5 will take place on the Horde side of things. So, for those who may not know, professions and just materials mattered a lot back in Classic, mainly because they had a pretty big use and role inside of the game back in Classic compared to now, where a lot of, at least the older content materials, are pretty useless unless if you're wanting to find some crafted transmog, which of course then you have a little bit of demand for the older content materials such as linen cloth. So we'll definitely want to take a look at some locations to farm your linen cloth. That way when Classic comes around, we'll actually have some of those locations pinpointed and you can easily farm them. So the first location that we'll be taking a look at is of course here in Elwyn Forest, and it is right outside of the human starting zone, and you'll just find yourself farming the mobs right around this little location right here, which will be the Defias cut purses. So these mobs don't necessarily have the greatest chance of dropping your linen cloth, but they do have a chance of dropping anywhere from 1 to 3 of the linen cloth. And of course, you won't be able to kill the mobs as fast as I am in Classic, mostly because you'll be roughly around their same level, unless if you are a pretty high level and just wanting linen cloth, so you come down to Elwyn Forest to kill all of these mobs. They are set on a forced respawn, at least here in retail. I'm not entirely sure what it's going to be like in Classic, but by the time you get done killing all of the mobs as a single player, they should start to respawn. You also have a couple of them that will spawn over on this side of the road as well, so be sure to kill these ones over here too. That'll be all for this location, so let's go ahead and take a look at our next one here in Elwyn Forest. Alright, so we are here at our second location, which of course is in Elwyn Forest, and we'll actually be taking a look at this cave that I believe a lot of people have forgotten about. I don't typically quest here in Elwyn Forest, and I don't typically quest up to this location when I do. It's one of those quests that I usually will skip, because by the time you even pick this quest up, you are pretty well off in questing in Westfall. But for those who don't use heirlooms, that might not necessarily be the case anyways. We'll be killing a lot of these kobold miners, which I would be careful of these, because if I remember correctly, back in at least Wrath of the Lich King, these mobs hit pretty hard, so that is a downside to that, and there are a bunch of them. So there are a bunch of them outside of the cave, and then there are a bunch of them inside of the cave, meaning you want to be decently geared when trying to farm these if you are farming them around your level, or I guess around the low level. So I believe these are level 6 to 8, which means you'll want to be at least level 7 to 8, I'd say, before you strictly farm these mobs. Do keep in mind that you will be leveling up while farming these if you do hour-longs worth of farming. So that is another good thing to take note about these types of farms, and that goes along with my skinning guides as well. But as you can see, there are just a ton of these kobold miners throughout the cave. The downside to them is they don't necessarily have a great drop chance for the linen cloth. There are better locations in Westfall that drop the linen cloth, but again, if you are kind of just starting out and want to farm a little bit of materials, then this is definitely one of the locations you'll want to head to. So let's go ahead and take out our third location here in Elwyn Forest, which is one of my favorite ones inside of Elwyn Forest. Alright, so we are over here at our last location here in Elwyn Forest, and we'll be killing a lot of these river paw mobs that are spawning up along the side of Elwyn Forest. It'll be your far left side and up close to Westfall. This is one of my favorite locations for learning cloth, at least inside of Elwyn Forest, mostly because of the river paw mobs. I really like the sprites of these mobs. I really like the amount of learning cloth they drop. I like how hacked they are and how many of them usually spawn. So they're just overall a pretty decent mob to farm for learning cloth, at least from what I have found out. One thing to note about these mobs though is they do hit hard, and in Classic, I don't believe their forced respawn is going to be as good as it is here in Retail, but because there are so many of them, it will definitely take you a long time to actually be able to kill all of the mobs within this location, unless if there's quite a few other people farming them as well. But for the most part, by the time you get done clearing from the top, clear down to this part of their spawn location, the mobs should start to respawn back up at the top. But that'll be all for this location, and we can go ahead and head over to our last two, which will take place in Westfall. Alright, so now that we are here in Westfall, I would like to just kind of mention that there are several locations that we can choose to farm linen cloth here in Westfall, most of which are actually forced respawns. So, unfortunately, because I'm not entirely sure if forced respawns are a thing in Classic, I can't really cover a location that is a forced respawn, or I can't cover the fact that, or I can't really show that I am killing mobs that are forced respawning and go over that location. However, what I can do is I can combine the two locations that I know are pretty good. So here in Westfall, you can bounce back and forth between this little location right here at the very beginning of Westfall once you enter, and then the location right over here. So these mobs are pretty well packed, and of course they're the river paw mobs, which I really enjoy farming linen cloth off of. I think the biggest reason why is just because a lot of the popular guides for linen cloth, or the popular locations for linen cloth right now, are usually your river paw mobs. So the river paw mobs just in general are really good, and of course you will want to be bouncing back and forth. One thing to definitely keep in mind that I haven't mentioned yet is if you're going to be farming these in groups, then be sure to remember that group loot is not a thing in Classic, meaning you will, if you have a group of 2 people, then every other mob you'll be able to loot. If you have a group of 5 people, then you'll only be able to loot 1 out of 5 mobs killed. I believe that is how it used to work. Anyways, we'll go ahead and head on over to our last location here for the Alliance side. Alright, so we are here at our last location for learning cloth on the Alliance side. These mobs are pretty well packed and spread throughout a pretty large majority of the area. One thing to note about these mobs is they do have a chance of dropping, I believe it is the River Paul staff, if I can find the correct mob that drops it. It's right here, yep, the River Paul Mystic Staff. And if I am correct, that used to be a pretty good item. However, it is mostly just used for transmog at this current time because it has a unique skin. So whether or not it's going to be a good material or a good weapon in Classic, I can't say for sure. But either way, this is a pretty good location for your landing cloth. Uh, Basically, these mobs spawn throughout this entire area right here, and I believe a little bit up here as well. So it's a pretty large area of Westfall that these mobs spawn in, and they have by far the highest chance of dropping the linen cloth out of the locations that I have shared. Although that is all for the Alliance side of things, so let's go ahead and take a look at the Horde side of things. Alright, so we are here in Bogor, taking a look at one of the other locations, or actually our first location for linen cloth on the Horde side. So this location is pretty good, and there are actually several more, believe it or not, of the River Paul type mobs that spawn throughout Mulgore. Again, these are some of my favorites, just because they've always seemed to have a pretty high chance of dropping the linen cloth, which is always a good thing to note when you are, I guess, trying to look for your own guides and places to farm materials. There, you do kind of catch on to a couple of things for mobs that tend to drop more of a certain material you're looking for compared to others. And the gnolls are definitely one of those mobs that seem to have a tendency of dropping a decent amount of linen cloth. Although that's not necessarily always the case. Anyways, if you farm these mobs, I highly recommend that you actually come over to this larger area right here. There are two little huts that they spawn at, and there is one that is a bit larger than the other, and I just recommend coming to the second one. If you run out of mobs to kill over at this location, don't worry, then you can hop over to the other little spawn point and hope for the best. Again, here in retail, they are on a forced respawn, so it is a little challenging to properly cover, but for the most part, you really shouldn't be running out of these mobs as they spawn clear over here, and there's just a ton of them. So by the time you get done killing a lot of the others, you should start to see them respawning where you first started to kill them, which is always a nice thing. Again, if you are in a group, then you might have a little bit of downtime, but also don't forget about the fact that there isn't going to be any group loot. So let's go ahead and head on over to our second location for linen cloth on the Horde side. Alright, so we are over here at our second location for the Horde site. Again, this takes place in Mulgore. The Harpies are another mob that I have noticed drop a decent amount of linen cloth, a bit more than a lot of the other mobs that spawn throughout the zones that are humanoid. With that being said, there are some Harpies and Duotar that are also really good for linen cloth as well, although I'm not entirely sure that they are going to make this video, which is why I am mentioning right now. Those mobs have a tendency of spawning right around this little area right here. But anyways, you should never run out of these Harpies unless if you've got a lot of other players that are back here farming them, mostly just because their spawn area is so large. They are pretty well decently spread apart, which is kind of good because I do remember Harpies hitting really hard. I even remember struggling with killing Harpies with heirlooms on at one point, so they are a pretty strong mob to try and kill. So them being spread apart is really good. Anyways, as you can see, this location is fairly large, and it actually, I believe, they come all the way up around here as well. But for the most part, you want to stay right around the left side of Thunder Bluff, which is where a majority of these mobs are spawning in at. So that'll be all for this location. Let's go ahead and take a look at our third location, which will be over in Duatar. Alright everyone, so we are here at our third location for landing cloth on the Horde side, and it is here in Duatar, right here at this little mountain right here. It is just above Razor Hill, located at the Dustwind Cave. So for those who aren't familiar with this location, you should be able to get to it through a quest. I'm not entirely sure if it is available to you in Classic, but right here is Razor Hill, and you'll want to go back behind the large building here, or you should be able to get out of it pretty easily, and you'll just want to head over this way, and the cave is located right here. We'll be killing a lot of these Burning Blade NPCs right here, and they also seem to have a pretty high chance of dropping the landing cloth, and of course, by the time you get done killing the last few mobs inside of this cave, they should start to respawn at the very beginning. So there really isn't a whole lot to this, but there is a really large thing to note here. If you are a miner, this cave is really good for some copper ore, so if you are wanting to pick up a little bit of linen cloth, or just farm linen cloth in general, and pick up some copper along the way, this is a really good location to do it at, because keep in mind that the ore will respawn over time, and if you are farming this location for an hour's worth of time, then you should see a decent amount of copper ore throughout your hour's worth of farming. However, that will be all for this location, and we'll go ahead and take a look at our fourth one. Alright, so we are over here looking at our Razor Maul boars here in Duatar, which are located at the top of the starting area for the troll and orcs. This location is definitely another one that I would recommend being decently geared for if you are trying to get the linen cloth. The mobs are pretty well packed, and obviously you're not going to want to pull a whole lot of them, at least starting off as a new character. Once you get geared a bit and a high enough level, then you shouldn't have too much to worry about, but there are two different locations for this, and you'll want to kind of bounce back and forth between the two. If any at all, I would recommend starting off at the back one, or the very last location over here, just because there are a decent amount more mobs that are spawning, and you should be able to just set in that, or just set in this location right here and kill all of the Razor Maul boars. Again, another thing to note about this location is it is pretty decent for copper ore as well. It's not as good as the cave for the Burning Blade mobs, but for the most part, you should see a couple of copper nodes spawning here and there. So that will be all for this location, and we can go ahead and take a look at our last one. Alright, so I wasn't entirely sure that I'd be able to cover the harpies here in Duatar. I did have a couple of other locations in mind, but I needed to check them out on the classic wildhead before I got too far into it. And it looks like we'll end up sticking with the harpies. Anyways, like the first set of harpies I had covered there in Bogor, these ones have a pretty good chance of dropping the linen cloth. Do keep in mind that these mobs hit a little bit harder than most of the others, so I would definitely not pull a whole lot of these, at least at the start. But you can find them spread throughout this entire area right here. Another thing to note about these mobs is, or not really these mobs, but this location is, it's pretty good for copper ore. This one and the Burning Blade cultists are both really good locations for your copper ore. So I'd kind of recommend coming here mainly if you are a miner. That way you can pick up a little bit of copper ore here and there, as well as collecting quite a bit of your linen cloth. Uh, One thing that I really want to mention before I end this guide is please don't forget that the stack sizes are decreased to 20 in Classic, meaning you can't just kind of sit around and farm necessarily for an hour straight. I do know there's going to be a lot of people who are going to want to and probably have ways of doing it, but your inventory will fill up very quickly in Classic, and you will definitely want to make sure that you have the bag space that you are going to need when you are farming any kind of material inside of Classic, or just farming any kind of farming location in general. You're going to want the bag space, and a lot of the reasons why I stuck with the first view zones that actually focus on linen cloth is because you're pretty close to the auction house. So all of the locations were really fairly close to the auction houses or major cities, so that way players don't have to worry too much about that inventory space. That'll be all though, so thanks for watching. Don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe.